Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. A few heads up before we begin. This is a paid review. Yes, I do those, but it depends on a number of factors. Also, I'm going to be a bit more carefree in this review because this is like my second or third time recording it, and I'm just tired of fighting with it, so if I feel a little less scripted, you'll know why. Also, I do apologize for the lateness of this review. I've had a lot of real-life stuff getting in the way of me doing the things that I care about, like writing and reviewing works. So just a heads up, this review is going to be different. I'm going to go over the story in its entirety and hit on my points throughout, rather than cramming them into their own individual sections. I will have a section at the end to cover stuff that I wanted to talk about in more detail, or if I had an overall theme I wanted to cover. But with that out of the way, let's get on with The Trials of Oma. We are introduced to our main character, In. He has spent his whole life training to be a wolf. It's a sort of guardian and scout with a dash of soldier thrown in for good measure. He doesn't like it. And like most teenagers, I'm pretty sure he's a teenager at least, he thinks there must be more out there, somewhere out in the ether. He's not training now, as he's in a smoke shop with what I'm not sure is either a friend or a mentor or a knight. I'm not quite sure exactly what he is, but his name is Deny, which, now that I'm saying it myself, sounds a lot like deny as in to deny somebody access, which is a pretty good summation of his character. Anyway, Deny tells In about some creatures which have ambushed a caravan belonging to somebody important. In is kind of excited, as he has an insatiable wanderlust and wants to see the world. He especially wants to befriend a Tamas raider, the sworn enemy of his own people. But In thinks recapturing what these Argul beasts that ambushed the caravan took could be a fun adventure. Soon after the meeting, In sneaks out of the city to see the site of the ambush. He does make a point to tell us that he doesn't actually have to sneak out of the city, because he could just show the guards his badge and everything would be peachy. But In's not going to pass up an excuse to use his magic. Now, it's not explicitly called magic, but he stores it in his body and calls upon it by yelling commands. So it's either magic or anime. That said, a magic arrow, a bit of mass manipulation, and a cloak of invisibility later, and he's out into the wilds. I really can't fault the kid. I like to use the back doors too. In eventually finds the spot of the ambush and follows the trail back to a pool of water. Diving in, he comes up in a cave full of dead Arguls. Well, all but one are dead. The one that's alive is conveniently pinned to the wall with a knife. So In uses his anime to invade the creature's mind. While engaging in the most privacy invasion it is possible to do, In discovers that the Arguls were hired to get a metal map. The Arguls are greedy by nature, and so they kept the payment, the spoils, and the map. Naturally. When the client showed up to claim what he hired them for, he showed his displeasure by ending the contract, and then ending his contractors. In also discovered that this Argul in particular has swallowed the map. After a quick slice of the monster's belly, In retrieves the map. In barely has a moment to enjoy the arid air in the cave that he passed through a pond to get to, when he's attacked by some dude with a scimitar. This is the same guy who contracted the Arguls in the first place. He also looks like a Tamas raider, which makes In's day. He's always wanted a Tamasi friend. In tries to engage the barbarian in conversation. The Tamas apparently doesn't want to talk. Either that or swinging a sharpened bit of metal at the tender parts of someone you just met is the Tamasi way of saying hello. I wouldn't doubt that given the rest of this book. The fight doesn't go the Tamas's way, and so he collapses half of the cave, leaving behind a mark that In interprets as "Meet me 3 weeks from today." I want to stop here and address two things. First, I am heavily abbreviating what's happened so far in the book. This is because the prose are wordy, like really wordy. I think the author was going for purple prose, but they're not quite where they should be. It's also not exactly the in-their-own-head exposition of ACOTAR, though that is a bit closer. I'm reminded of the thing I disliked most about Lord of the Rings, the long explanations of everything under the sun, or in this book's case, the saw. While being compared to Tolkien might not be a bad thing for some people, I did find the long explanations and the long sidetracks distracting at best. Second, this book has its own unit of measurement, the Oma. I assume this is an approximation of meter because they use kiloma when traveling. I don't like this because I'm not sure how long an Oma is. I'm also not sure if the book goes into it. Maybe it does, but I backtracked a lot in this book and didn't find the explanation. That said, every time it's brought up, I'm reminded I don't know how long an Oma is. To give an example from our own world, the mile is the descendant of the Roman unit for 1,000 paces. This is not an exact unit of measure, but I have a rough approximation of how long that is. Regardless, units of measurement in a fantasy world can be tricky. It does feel more authentic for a world to have its own, but you run the risk of taking the reader out of the story. I think it's best to either use the imperial system or the one the French made up, if you really have to. Back to the story. En has returned home. His home happens to be a treehouse. Before you go thinking he's childish, it turns out everyone in En's hometown lives in treehouses. This is because they live in a forest. Anyway, En receives a visit from his captain. Not to be confused with the guy he was talking to earlier, which I did at first. This guy is a legend because he survived 2 fights with a guy named Eviar, who's really big in the Tomas. This guy is so badass he's called the Warmonger. We'll get more into Eviar later, because he's mentioned a lot later. After a conversation with his captain, which I didn't take notes on and remember nothing about, En goes off to train. His training spot is a 2-day journey from his home. I glance wearily back at the start of this book where En was lamenting he never gets to go anywhere. Ignoring that for now, En goes off to a special secluded training spot, which he likes because there are no distractions. Here he trains his magic cloak armor, which he can hold for a solid minute. He then spends the next week training alone, with no one else around. Once he's done, he drinks some Magic Creek water and falls asleep to heal. He wakes up thinking there are bugs crawling all over his skin, which we find out is an effect of the water. I'm not sure it's worth it regardless of how much it heals, but, to each their own. We also find out Omani, En's people, have blue skin. Anyway, Denai shows up and he and En have a sparring match. After receiving a bit of a beating, Denai reveals that he has fire powers and shoots out a gout of flame that knocks En out. When En wakes up, he's shackled to the back of an ox-like creature. He has been captured by Saba, the Tomas warrior he met earlier. Saba is a crafty fellow and waited for the captain to knock En out before he rushed in to capture him. Now he's taking En to be sold. This is so Saba can get the funds to raid En's village. He really wants that metal map he contracted the Arguls to steal for him. En, being completely unfazed by this, says he will work to gain his freedom and the respect of the Tomas. Saba thinks this is funny. And I agree, it's pretty darn funny, given En's position. After a walk through the city, En is forcibly shoved into an arena to fight a big black giant named Mid-Z. En uses his magic, but the gladiator absorbs it and pushes the energy out as heat. After a brutal beating, in which I think En blows out 2 arms and a leg, Saba joins in and uses his own powers to hold Mid-Z in place, while En uses his last leg to attempt a final blow on the giant. Then Denai shows up and attacks the gladiator, and the rest of the arena. It turns out the whole thing was a ruse of some kind. A bunch of fighting happens, the arena is destroyed, and somehow En escapes with Saba. The plan, it turns out, was to make both sides, the En and the Tomas, think that Saba and En were working for the other side. Why? I'm not sure. Anyway, Saba still wants the map. En is afraid that Saba wants this to make it easier for the Tomas to raid Omani territory. But Saba says that he's looking for a treasure, something that's more precious than gold. En agrees to sneak back into his hometown and retrieve the map. They ride most of the way back on what I can only describe as a bipedal sandworm mixed with a porcupine called a Schnott. I'm not going to joke about the name. I am not going to joke about the name. Moving on, I have to say, I'm not a big fan of the constant turnaround in this story so far. I had real trouble keeping track of who was on whose side and why, because the characters are changing allegiances at the drop of a hat. Yes, Saba explains why he went from wanting to sell In to working with him, but comparing it with what I know happens later and how I felt at the time, Saba feels really inconsistent. Also, this plan feels like it was introduced for the plot's sake rather than it being an interesting twist. That said, I can kinda get what the author was going for. That Saba saw his chances were better working with In, but the turnaround still isn't very believable. Also, In's willingness to forgive and work with a man who moments ago wanted to sell him into slavery raises a lot of other questions. At first I thought he was just naive. I won't spoil it, but I don't think I was far off. When it's time to dismount and walk so they aren't spotted, Saba gives In a container full of Silver Creek water, the same stuff that healed him before. It's not lost on In that Saba made him travel for days while injured, something I also have questions about. They agree that Saba will set off a distraction so In can sneak into town and steal the map, which works out perfectly. The distraction goes off, In enters his house, steals his own stuff, and leaves with just a sad glance back that he's now leaving his hometown forever. In and Saba meet up again and look at the metal map. Here we find out that the Tamas are carnivorous while the Omani are herbivorous. While looking at the map trying to find where the treasure is hidden, the wind blows or the map shifts to reveal where they should go next. Seems a bit capricious, but I like the spirit. This does give the story a bit of a grand adventure on a whim vibe. Something I have done in my own life, but with preferable outcomes. Because while my adventure ended with a weekend of good food and cool stories, In's adventure continues with him waking up to a hostile woman holding a knife to his throat. Been there, buddy. Been there. Well, In wasn't really sleeping at the time. He was looking at the map under the moonlight to reveal more information while Saba was asleep. This woman caught him while he was distracted. Her name is Corvana. Saba wakes up and explains that she is both a mutt and has a useless power which allows her to take on the pain of others. No one dies, Corvana is tied up, not before In can use his mind invasion powers to read her soul. He does allow her the dignity of not exploring the memories she's desperately trying to hide from him. A weird courtesy for someone who was just holding a knife to your throat, but this is In. And if the Boy Scouts were a thing in this world, he'd be the most Eagle Scout to ever scout. They leave Corvana tied up and continue on their merry way. They reach their first destination, and it's a dead place. What makes it a dead place? Well, it smells of rot, it has a big tree made of corpses, and there's a giant dead lizard bird thing that's feeding the dead tree. I have to admit, I kind of like this. It feels like something you would encounter in a homebrew D&D campaign. They can't just kill the tree. The map revealed to In that there was something important here. Unfortunately, the bird thing in the tree won't stop attacking In and Saba. The battle ensues and we learn 3 things. First, that Saba is basically a geomancer. That's not entirely true. He uses vibrations to manipulate the matter around him. The second thing we learn is that the tree eats souls and it's linked to the bird thing that's feeding it. This goes along with number 3, where we find out that the tree can expel magic, which we find out when In fires one of his magic arrows at the bird, and the magic comes out of the tree. In is then fed to the tree. Upon falling in, he's immediately assaulted by negative thoughts and just wants to die. The internal walls of the tree constrict to hold him in place. Just as he's about to give up, his mind is filled with a new voice that tells him to fight on, which he does, and the tree expands again. He is now in a cavernous room and is approached by a man named Hakor the Zombie Wolf. Now, I'm going to note here that I'm not sure if the tree expands making the room, or if there's some kind of weird time-space stuff going on that just makes the inside of the tree bigger than the outside of the tree. Anyway, back to the story. It turns out this man is an exile from In's people. He did some gruesome experiments with life and death. He also has a fan, which I think is also made of metal, which belongs to a long-dead warrior, and is the reason In was directed here by the map. Hakor directs In to rest before they fight. This is a weird courtesy, and In doesn't really listen. Then the fight begins. I wasn't kidding before when I made the anime joke. This fight is really anime. In's power grows because he's holding the map. It's unlocking his inner abilities. Hakor fights by stretching his arms and just enduring the beating with some weird kind of zombie endurance. Then Saba shows up to help. It turns out En is the inheritor of the soul of Parias, the guy whose fan they're trying to get from the zombie wolf. They beat Hakor, he vomits up the fan, and En and Saba continue on their merry way. Also during the fight we find out that the voice in En's head is a priestess. Again, I'm going to stop for a moment. I want to point out that I had real trouble following the action as the descriptions and the side tangents kept pulling me away. It wasn't helped by everyone talking like they have a master's in English. I would start to get into what was going on when we'd get another long-winded rant or some obscure wording, and I would immediately be yanked from the story. I get that a lot of fantasy authors are trying hard to mimic pulp writing these days. I'm not sure that's what's going on here, but the prose and tangents are taking more away from the story than they're adding. Back to the story. En and Saba are traveling along a river, doing their best to avoid being spotted by pirates and merchants alike. Saba reveals he's found a log, the journal entry, not the felled tree, and that he can't read it. En is able to read the log, and it turns out to be part of a trilogy of stories about the fight between Parias, the guy whose soul En inherited, and the god of suffering Tiamattu. En then touches the tablet to the map and receives a vision. We are told that En is the reincarnation of Parias, which I'm pretty sure is what inheriting someone's soul meant, but maybe I'm wrong. And that Tiamattu has no such reincarnation because he's the god of suffering and other reasons. I'm also pretty sure this was explained by the priestess that can talk to En mentally. After this, En and Saba arrive at a village near a pink beach. The villagers grow vast nuts. No, that's not something perverted. They're oddly large, melon-like nuts that are what the Tamas use to make their armor. Saba explains that the people here are kept poor and exploited by others who profit off their hard work. We also find out that everyone in the village is dying. It turns out someone has made it so that none of the villagers can sleep. So they haven't for weeks, and now they all want to die. Saba kills the villagers, then En and Saba are attacked by some elite assassins. The assassins knock our heroes out, but not before they show them their freakish deformities, and then they haul them away. I have another problem here. The assassins, if I'm following the book correctly, are the people profiting off the farmers who grow the vast nuts. They're already taking the bulk of the farmers' work and profiting immensely from it. Why did they feel the need to torture these people to death? I get that they're supposed to be evil people, but this isn't human evil. They're hurting themselves by doing this. Moving on. En wakes up hanging from a meat hook. He has a conversation with Saba that doesn't really matter because it's a dream. En reasons this out through his dream Saba because he still has the map and fan on his person and believes the assassins would have relieved him of those. He wakes up from a sudden case of realizing he's in a dream. I hate it when that happens. He and Saba are indeed shackled, and the artifacts were taken from him. The assassins are part of a group called the Zathori, and are trying to sell the artifacts to a pair of adjoined twins. En makes a proposition for the twins to buy him and Saba. This is so he won't be separated from the artifacts. The twins agree because having an Omani slave is a mark of status. Also, the poison they use to knock En and Saba out prevents Saba from using his powers. Their new owners take them home to their mansion. Then they put them inside of a hot rock to sweat out the poison and see how much they can endure. I know this sounds like something out of a Chinese fable, but it's what the book says happens. They can also see out of the rock, for some reason. Once En and Saba are free, Saba attacks the twins. It is revealed that the hot rock was a test to see if these two were really warriors, which they passed. Also, they can't kill the twins because the twins hid the artifacts somewhere. This is because they have a job for En. They want him to kill the assassins who sold them. Mostly because while they sell them lots of cool stuff, the twins really don't make a profit, as the assassins will kill them if they don't buy what they're selling, and so make them buy everything at a really high price. After some haggling, En agrees, takes the artifacts with him, and leaves Saba behind as collateral. En is given a horn to call a flying mount that dilutes the time around it, which makes it age everything, including its rider and anything that just happens to be in its proximity. It can also sense En's intentions, so instead of taking him straight to where the assassins are, It takes him to the valley where the priestess who's been talking in his head resides. A short time later, En is educated about his reincarnation, the fan, and his powers. En then transforms into a Drakeen, which is either a dragon or a dragon person. I'm not entirely sure. He then flies off to the assassin's hideout. En stacks all of his powers, kills the 2 assassins who attacked him and Saba, then he is attacked by Danae. Danae reveals that he planned everything so En's bounty would be higher when he eventually captured him. Then En kills Danae. I think. En cuts off the 2 assassins' heads, calls the flying time beast, and flies back to the mansion. When En arrives back at the mansion, he finds that Saba has killed everyone, including the twins. For good measure, he tore out their tongues. En is upset by this, and after some internal monologuing and a conversation with Saba, who explains the twins were planning on betraying them, he decides it's better the murderer continues to travel with him. Again, I have trouble with this. En doesn't have much more reason to trust Saba over the twins. The biggest reason is both En and Saba are wanted criminals at this point in the story. They've been traveling together for a few weeks. But Saba hasn't exactly been friendly and has done shifty things before this, one of which was trying to sell En into slavery. At this point, En would be well within his rights and within common sense to strike out alone, or finish off Saba. I'm torn on this. I can see how having Saba around would be helpful, but it's probably a better choice to leave him behind. Anyway, back to the story. Then 2 spies from the assassin group show up, look around, one turns into a big flying beast, and they fly away. Saba says he doesn't want to fight Rillandor, who is the leader of the Zathori, and a big deal among the Tamas. He's a spiritual leader despite being 14 years old. Well, guess who shows up next? Eviar followed by Rillandor, the 2 most dangerous people in the Tamasi lands. En's captain also shows up right before the fight begins and jumps in with Eviar. En and Saba get trapped in an impromptu shelter with Rillandor, who it turns out is radioactive. Or something so similar there's really no difference. Luckily, the radioactive teenager can control it. To a point. As Eviar and En's captain tear up the landscape outside, Rillandor wants to know what En and Saba are doing, and the purpose of their journey. En doesn't want to tell him, so they make a bet on who will win the fight outside. A bet which En loses, and now he has to spill his guts to radioactive men. Rillandor, it turns out, is supportive of their journey, and offers to give them a guard, which En turns down. Rillandor also banishes Saba from all Tamasi lands, unless he's escorted by En. At least the 14-year-old is wise. If you're wondering about the fight, Eviar won after it's revealed he has a healing factor and only gets stronger the more he's hurt and regenerates. The captain lost despite having the powers of lightning and magnetism. En gives the captain his remaining Silver Springs water. Before falling asleep, he tells En that he needs to go to the forest of Kath to train, which he and Saba do. They arrive at the forest, which I think is underground, but the trees are crystalline and absorb sunlight, so the forest is luminescent. I think. Also, En goes a bit crazy when they enter the forest and starts running away. I don't know why this is considered crazy, but anyway. Saba chases him for about a day, whacks him on the head, and then they meet Jai. Jai is an old woman and the trainer they were looking for. This old woman steals En's ability to infiltrate minds, and then does the same thing that En has done to En. She quickly learns everything he knows. Kind of. En is told he will have to learn how to draw on the power of Oma, the world they're on. And so the training begins. In no particular order, En trains with Jai, trying to catch her. Saba trains with the essence of another warrior. En figures out how to get around Jai's command ability, which lets her control people. He also learns how to draw on the power around him. And Saba crushes his opponent to death while wearing the ground like it's power armor. We are made aware that in 10 days the world will stop spinning as the seal on Tiamatu is weakening. The sun then gets blotted out, it's night all the time, and all the birds fall out of the sky dead. The time for training is over, and during this, Jai warns En that Saba is probably going to betray him. This isn't the exact order of events, but it's close enough. En and Saba continue their journey and come across a prison. A Tamasi prison, which I found odd as the Tamas are supposed to be a raider tribal state. But here we are. The prison is run by Saba's brother. We are invited inside after Saba kicks En's legs out from under him in an attempt to pretend he's the new prisoner, and the guard immediately knows he's lying. This felt pointless as Saba's brother just yells at them to come in from inside the prison. I also thought this was where Saba was going to betray En. Luckily it wasn't. I do appreciate that the new prisoner trope failed. Sneaking into a prison is not as easy as some random guy showing up with another random guy and claiming he's a prisoner. Saba's brother has dream powers, which makes him the perfect warden for the prison because even if they escape, apparently he can just haunt their dreams and make them come back. This prison exists to store Tamasi prisoners whose power makes them too dangerous to allow freedom, like one individual we see with his head stuck in a cauldron, which itself is stuck in a divot in the floor. This individual has the power to create anything he wants as long as he can see the space in front of him. He's also insane. Naturally, he is responsible for numerous horrors being unleashed on the world. Okay, this makes the prison make a bit more sense. But given the Tamas have shown themselves to be at best indifferent to the act of killing, I'm not sure why they would think imprisonment would be a better option. Anyway, En and Saba are escorted to Saba's brother's office. Then we get a family feud that honestly does more to characterize the Tamas than the events we've read before. The feud is over a dagger in the older brother's possession. It's an artifact passed down from father to son. The father originally intended to give it to Saba, but while he was dying, the older brother lied and said Saba had been killed. And so the father gave the dagger to the older brother. Saba says, and the older brother does not contest, that the reason the older brother was passed over was because he wasn't a true warrior. The older brother's power, while terrifying and useful, did not endear him to their father, neither did the older brother's craftier nature. This led to neglect, and the older brother lied so that he could feel like he got a bit of approval from his father. I like this a lot. It tells us so much about the Tamas. The older brother has a power that is identified by his own people as being tremendously useful, and yet it is completely socially acceptable and understandable that he would be the less worthy son because his power was not directly offensive. We also saw this with Corvana, but I can kind of understand that one. Anyway, the older brother hands over the dagger after a lot of threats are exchanged and tells Saba and En to leave, which is exactly what they do. We then find out there's nothing special about the old chipped dagger, other than sentimental value. This is where Saba asks En about his family, and we find out that En's father was killed by a Tamasi raider, and his mother was killed by a jilted suitor. So En isn't as naive as we originally thought. He's got indomitable spirit, as some would say. I personally think he's an idiot that's going to get more of what he's already gotten. But this is fiction, and you can actually expect the best in people and be right more often than in real life. The two press on and find themselves in front of a tomb that's older than recorded history. They go inside, and after the room fills with blood, which then shrinks to the size of a puddle, a creature called a necroshift crawls out. Then it immediately starts breaking the laws of physics by floating. What is a necroshift? My best guess is it's a kind of composite abomination that takes on the abilities of the things that it eats. Most don't speak, but this one does, and we learn his name is Al-Haram. Al-Haram is evil in the old sense. He's an irredeemable creature of hunger and death. He's also insane, and at one time ate every member of the Proto-Amani race, leaving one alive to repopulate while he took a nap for a few thousand years. En and Saba prepare for a fight, but Al-Haram says they aren't ripe yet. Then he says he's going to eat Tiamatu when he wakes up. Al-Haram then makes the tomb spit out the two intruders, and the monster and his lair disappear. Honestly, I'm torn with Al-Haram, but we'll talk more about him later. En and Saba reach the sea. En spends his time thinking about Corvana and the past encounters he's had on this journey. Then they get a boat to head to the island that's known as a Scorch Zone. While sailing, they pass a pack of sirens. Or that's what I assume they are. They're not really a problem. Saba distorts the air to make a shield to protect them, and the two move on with little to no inconvenience. Before arriving at the island, Saba gives In a ball of oxygen, so he can breathe if need be when they get into the Scorch Zone. When they reach the island, it's hot, and the sun is shining. This is despite the fact that the sun is blotted out everywhere else. Using one of his many powers, In looks to the center of the island. He sees a giant translucent mushroom with a lot of plants growing at its base. Then he sees a giant lion-like creature sleeping on the top of the mushroom. Since it's so hot, In travels in his Drakeen form, and Saba makes his giant walking dirt suit to protect himself. After much sweating and complaining, they reach the center and touch the big mushroom. This wakes up the lion creature that is also made out of fire. The creature is not happy at first. Then it recognizes In as the reincarnation of Parias. The creature is happy until the subject of Saba comes up. In says that Saba's help was invaluable, and the lion thing now has to fight them. Anime fight ensues, In gets a big energy weapon and some advice from Saba. Then In wins the fight, and the giant fire lion tells In that if he wants the key, the final artifact of Parias, he has to eat some of the big mushroom. In is hesitant at first because it smells really bad, but relents and eats some of the giant transparent mushroom. He immediately gets sick and vomits up the key. Weird that this happened twice in the book, but okay. Then the fire lion leaves this realm forever. This next part I'm a little unclear on. After the lion is gone, they find either a large mountain with a set of stairs in it, or a standalone staircase that ascends into the heavens that In must carry the key up to get to Tiamatu's seal. There are 3,000 steps, and the key is stupid heavy. About halfway up, In is so tired he's ready to give up. Saba tells him to rest and offers him a piece of meat. In's people can't eat meat, so he passes, but asks about the strange name of the meat. We are treated to one of the cooler stories in this book. The meat is part of a Tomas who had the ability to regenerate. In his time, his tribe was suffering through a famine. Since he regenerates, he told his people to break him into pieces. So long as the members of his tribe did not consume the whole of their piece, it would continue to regenerate. This was done on the promise that once the famine passed, they would put him back together so that he might live again. That is not what happened, as the neighboring tribes with more muscle found out about this miraculous food source and came a-raiding. To save themselves, they gave away some of the pieces, and the promise to put the man back together was never upheld. Obvious Jesus imagery aside, this is a good world-building fable, and it was well placed. After a short break, In is ready to try again, and the two start climbing the stairs until they come to a large castle-like structure. Here is the seal of Tiamatu. Right before In can use the key to reseal the god of suffering, Saba betrays him and breaks the whole structure using his powers. Yes, this is literally a curse your sudden yet inevitable betrayal moment. I'll be honest, I've seen worse, and while this book does make an effort to show that the two were becoming friends, we kinda saw this coming. The biggest reason being, we still have 20 chapters of the book to go. Anyway, In is falling out of the sky. I think he fell unconscious for a while and woke up mid-fall. He tries to summon what little magic he has left to make himself less dense, so landing from however high up he was won't be so bad. He hits the ground and fortunately doesn't irreparably break his body. He starts having a mental conversation with the Drakeen priestess from before. In unlocks more power and a final Drakeen form and starts flying off. His destination is the jail of Tiamatu. A bit of explaining is in order. The thing that Saba broke was not the prison of the god of suffering. It was merely the lock. Tiamatu was imprisoned under the capital city of the Omani, In's people. Luckily for In, his new form lets him see clear across the world to the capital and witness the god waking up and laying waste to everything and everyone. The bad news is, he's nowhere near fast enough to get there in time to do anything about it. Not that the god of suffering is going to allow that. Tiamatu extends an appendage for miles and touches Saba, who had a monstrous head start, and the traitor suddenly gains a lot of power. En meets Saba again, big anime fight ensues, and a giant area is leveled and both En and Saba are drained, with Saba being so beat up he's bleeding out. I know there was more to this fight, but it's much like the others in this book, so I'm not going into much detail. The audiobook is available for free on YouTube, feel free to give it a listen. Anyway, we get a bit of exposition and some heartfelt words between En and Saba. Saba wants En to finish him off, as bleeding out slowly is not a death worthy of a warrior. En has trouble with this because he doesn't want to give Saba what he wants, but he also doesn't like the idea of him suffering and darkening his own soul. En kills Saba with his own heirloom dagger, then flies off. The Drakeen priestess he's been mentally chatting with tells him to fly to the joint Omani and Tamasi army camps so he can take part in the fight to save the world. I think she lost some confidence in En after Tiamatu wiped out half the Omani capital for a morning workout. After En arrives at the camp, he is greeted relatively positively by everyone, despite the stuff that happened earlier in the book. Now he's recognized as the last hope to stop the now awakened god. This means he gets a seat on the War Council. This council is a who's who of the characters we've met and a few we haven't. Radioactive Man and EVR are there, as is the King of the Omani. After a quick and disrespectful look and chat with the king, we find out that the plan to assault Tiamatu and his amassing forces of darkness will happen in 3 waves. The first being the most durable warriors. At some point they will also use a previously unmentioned orbital guardian they somehow put into space. I'm really going to have to talk more on that later. En tells everyone about Al-Haram and how he's also a great threat. The leaders agree with En, but tell him they're not going to deviate from the plan. En then admits to killing Saba, gives bare-bones explanation as to why. Now with every Tamas good and pissed off, he leaves the War Council. After the meeting, En uses his powers to look towards Tiamatu. There he watches Al-Haram try to eat Tiamatu, and fail. Tiamatu then places his hand on the monster's head, and melts about half of it away. After healing, mostly, Al-Haram offers to serve Tiamatu, which Tiamatu accepts and tells the monster to lead his armies. He also says he's not going to give him any power, but that Al-Haram is free to eat whomever he kills in the war. Power struggle over, we can now move on to the war. This war takes place over 12 chapters, if I remember correctly, and this video is already much longer than I want to edit, so I'm going to cover it in brief. The first wave goes about as well as any initial assault. Massive casualties, horror beyond reckoning, and lots of general mayhem and chaos. Eventually, people split off into their own battles. Somehow, Al-Haram and En's old captain are paired up. The captain gets poisoned into paralysis by the monster, but uses his lightning powers to kill the both of them, and the battle moves on. Soon the battle comes down to a lot of really strong people trying to kill Tiamatu. Rillandor comes pretty close with his staring match that flays the flesh off the god of suffering. After his death, EVR goes nuts at losing his friend and sets a new standard. This mainly involves him treating the god of suffering like a baby-shaped chew toy in the pit bull pit, but soon the warmonger is also put in his place. Somewhere in here, the orbital guardian fails to kill Tiamatu. I was looking forward to what this weapon was. I only knew it failed because it's recalled later, and I'd already backtracked far more than I wanted to in this book. Now it comes to En's turn. There is a brief bit where En has a talk with Parias in the world between life and death. Parias tells En that he has to empty himself out and surrender all he is so that Parias can defeat Tiamatu again. En tries to do exactly as he's told and empty himself out, giving control over to Parias. Then a lot of extreme violence happens. Tiamatu unveils the weapon he made for death that can cleave just about anything. Parias tries to drop one of the moons on Tiamatu. I think time was manipulated and En and Parias are separated. Then Jai shows up to help by summoning the lock sage that locked away the god last time, but En has to buy her 3 minutes. Luckily, he also gets the help of one of the Alpha Generals that came along with the king. The fight continues until the sage is summoned and Tiamatu has his chest blown open. This reveals a weird child stuck to Tiamatu's insides. This child is the product of all the suffering Tiamatu has accumulated, and En must kill it. It is super strong and super fast, and forces En to endure extreme suffering. or it would have if Corvana didn't show up and force all of N's suffering onto herself, saving his life. As she's dying, we find out that 1. She's pregnant, 2. The baby is Saba's, and 3. N can perform a battlefield cesarean while fighting the incarnation of suffering. A lot of exposition later, and N has to kill the child of suffering. This is something that gives him a lot of trouble because despite being the embodiment of all suffering of the world for the last few thousand years, it's still a child. Never mind, quandary over, Hate Baby is dead and Tiamatu is weakened. They then use the Lock Sage's power to lock Tiamatu away in one of the remaining moons. To do this, N must accept Parias' sword, which makes him a high priest. He then sticks the sword into the god of suffering, turns it like a key, and bing bang boom, the war is over. We wrap up the story with a 40-minute chapter which I'm going to describe in brief. The Omani and the Tomas come together to reach terms with each other. They plan to build a road between their capitals that connects all the towns between them. The Omani give the Tomas some farmable land. The Queen of the Tomas wants Saba's child, but N refuses because he wants to raise it. Then N is proclaimed a hero to everyone at some big meeting and goes down in the history books as a legend. The end. Alright, let's get into my last section, which will be a bit more traditional. First, the things that I liked. This book feels like an old fable. This is more an atmospheric thing than any particular element of storytelling that I can identify. Everything is undefinably old. Things exist outside of logical reasons for them to exist. It feels like one of the old heroic epics written before conventional rules. That said, it also has the unmistakable taint of anime. Shonen, to be exact. Don't get me wrong, I love my Japanese picture shows, but this book would have benefited from copying old fable logic, rather than anime logic. The book also has some really good lines and dialogue. It also has some really bad exposition and dialogue. I did want to take a moment to appreciate that there were lines in this book that took me by surprise. Sadly, that will also lead me into my dislikes. This book is too damn wordy. I don't want to sound mean, but it really does feel like the people in this world regularly dine on thesauruses. I discussed this with a friend and they informed me this is a common thing for some fantasy. The prose must be purple because it makes it feel authentic, or something along those lines. The prose kind of remind me of Razor Fist's first book, The Long Moonlight, though not as brain-crushingly dense. I know authors want to show off their lexiconal might, but I don't think a novel is the place to do it. I read because I want to escape, and English has so many words to help set the scene, we don't always have to pick them by the highest syllable count. It really took away from me enjoying the story. It wasn't just the prose either. This book has the Tolkien problem of incredibly long descriptions of everything around the character. This, mixed with the prose, makes my mind treat the story like background noise, and I kept missing important details. Had I chose to read this book and not listen to it, I probably wouldn't have finished it. It was a lot of work to listen to. It would have been more to read, and working is not why I read. Moving on to The Orbital Guardian. The first problem I had with this is that I thought this was a magical fantasy world. Then, near the end of the book, we're introduced to space-level technology. Understand, science and fantasy can work together, but you have to establish that's what you're doing really early. This is a square peg in a round hole situation. It just doesn't fit. I'm also still not sure what it was. I was having trouble finishing the book, so I put in my earbuds and went for a long walk. I still had to backtrack quite a bit, but I was determined I was going to get this book done. So I missed its use, or it was done off the page. I'm pretty sure it was some kind of charged particle cannon, but I don't remember it being used. Let's move on to my thoughts. We'll start with N's ignorance. I thought through most of the book that N was just ignorant. The way he immediately trusted Saba. How he's ready to trust other people to stick to their word. His childlike approach to almost everything going on. Then we find out he's not so ignorant of the world. It's just how he is. I think the book was going for a too good for this world vibe. But that's not what I picked up. He just comes off as a bad fit. There's a joke you hear a lot that goes, "I can't believe they ate my face," says the man who voted for the "We'll Eat Your Face" party. In is the living embodiment of that. He's constantly putting himself in situations where he can easily be betrayed. He's not the only one to do this. It's like the world is full of criminals who think they're the first person to discover lying. I think this is one of the things that makes the story feel more like a fable, that people act on hard-to-follow rationale, that never really gets explained. Maybe the characters weren't properly defined, or the definition got lost in the wordy nature of the book. Moving on to Al-Haram. Al-Haram really needed to be the antagonist in the story where he was the main antagonist. His character is a world-ending threat, but to have him play a last-minute second to Tiamattu did neither any favors. He also wasn't as off-putting as his character should have been. A bit of work needed to be done around him to make him feel worse. This should be a pretty easy thing to do, considering he's a stolen amalgamation of body parts and powers. That also brings us to Tiamattu. While he is the ultimate threat, he just doesn't feel like it. He either immediately dispatches every threat to him, or gets grievously wounded, regenerates, then immediately dispatches the threat. He's the most overpowered character in a book full of overpowered characters. There should have been more build-up to him, and as a god, he needs to have a bit more mystery. It doesn't help that the power scaling in this book really needs to be toned down. I didn't make the shonen comparison for nothing. Lastly, there's the lack of rest. This story feels like En and Saba are sprinting from one fight to the next with no downtime. The frantic pace, mixed with the meandering prose, makes for a disjointed feel. It isn't helped by the fact our main character gets almost no downtime. I think I only remember 2 times in the book where they slept, where they weren't knocked out. Which makes the sudden gains in power that En gets feel unearned. My final assessment of the book. This book needed to be broken up. Too much is trying to be done in the time presented. We needed more time to get to know En and Saba and build a relationship between them and explore the world they're in. I think the story takes place over several weeks, so there shouldn't be a problem in breaking it up into smaller books. I might be misreading things, but this feels like what happens when a short story writer wants to write a phone book fantasy. It's a bit like a sprinter suddenly deciding to run a marathon. The pros try to pack so much into every scene, but it's too much, and the main elements are lost in the shuffle. We're getting too much too fast, and it's hard to keep up. Toning down the powers in both effectiveness and number would also help. Books like Gardens of the Moon kinda get away with packing so much into so little, but it's part of a very exclusive club, and honestly, it was curiosity that got me through Malazan more than anything else. Ultimately, the story has some cool ideas, and there's potential, but it suffers from too much in too short a time. And with all that said, I wish you all good luck.